In today's workshop, we're going to talk about excellence in identification using multiple measures for equity. I'm joined by Steve Dunbar and Kathy Welch from the University of Iowa. Identifying and serving gifted and talented students requires understanding their current performance and potential. As I'll talk about in a little bit, multiple measures are best practice because of the range of information you need to identify and serve the students in your school. The Iowa assessments are an ideal solution for your achievement measures because of their unique characteristics.
Today we will talk about 4 different pieces that contribute to making the appropriate decisions for the identification of students for gifted and talented programs. We'll start with an overview of the Iowa assessments, followed by some of the appropriate measurement and psychometric characteristics that help make the Iowa assessments appropriate for this use. And then we'll look forward to combining across different measures and finally trying to create a more comprehensive and balanced approach to the identification of students. The next few slides help us go over some of the defining characteristics of the Iowa assessments themselves. And so before we segue into the characteristics that are more specific for today's conversation, we thought it might be beneficial to just give a quick overview of some of the long-standing characteristics that make the Iowa assessments a robust achievement that can be used for a variety of different purposes. We think of it primarily as a measure of core achievement standards that has with it a long-established vertical scale that allows us to assess student learning outcomes at every grade level, as well as providing growth estimates across grades. At the heart of it, it also provides relative comparisons. Those relative comparisons can be to other groups of individuals, whether they be district related, whether they be national samples, whether they be local comparisons. They can also provide comparisons to obviously the achievement standards. They can also provide comparisons to growth. So the comparisons cut across all these multiple purposes. We also consider the Iowa assessments as key for providing focused, actionable data that can be used to direct instruction, to differentiate what's happening in the classroom, but also to differentiate the instruction that's given to particular groups of students who are ready to move on to additional expanded curricular opportunities. At the heart of it, it all is developed and designed by a research core at the University of Iowa and published through Riverside Insights. A couple other defining characteristics that I think are critical to today's conversation: the ability to take the information and provide it in very actionable data through a variety of reporting resources, whether it be web-based, whether it be paper, whether it be the ability to disaggregate or aggregate for different purposes, the reporting resources. And again, as we talk about specific groups of test takers and wanting to use the information to inform the appropriate decisions for them, the reporting functions and their richness really address that ability. The research base that we referenced in the previous slide really talks to the samples, the work, the experts, the validation evidence that's collected, not only with a national sample in mind, but with very specific samples, and being able to say something, make inferences, generalize to very specific groups of test takers. And finally, the information is accessible. It's accessible for educators, it's accessible for students and families. It is there, it provides information, again, that's understandable and can, again, maybe in this environment more so than many others, be used by a wide variety of audiences that can use it in different contexts to move forward for groups of test takers.
One of the things that you're going to be hearing from us as we go through this presentation that relates to reporting resources will be the ability to combine information from different assessments that can sort of come together in the process of identifying students for talented and gifted programs. The Iowa Assessments is part of a data-based reporting capability that it can integrate, for example, information from the Iowa Assessments and the cognitive abilities test. And we'll be talking more about the integration of that kind of information. But it's important to indicate here that those resources are all part of the same software that provides the reports from those two assessments.
So with that as an overview, I think for today's session, we want to focus more on the connections that the Iowa makes to achievement. And as we sort of look further into this session, talking about connections to abilities in addition, and putting those two parts of the world together into a more comprehensive view of a student's abilities and what they're ready for. But for the Iowa Assessments, we're very much tied to content standards, those core curricular standards that are defined by districts, by schools, by states, that take this larger body of knowledge and divide it into standards and domains that really help us assemble the Iowa Assessments. And those Iowa Assessments are built according to those test specifications and bring with them a great alignment as a source of content validity evidence, so that we can say with confidence how this particular student is doing on particular content standards. We have, in addition to that, descriptions of how test takers are doing, multiple level descriptions, narrative descriptions. In addition, we can look again at that point of comparison, whether it be national, whether it be local, whether it be somewhere in between those two, to allow those connections for the Iowa Assessment to be made, to be tied to the decisions being made for test takers. So with that in mind, how does it tie directly to the identification of students for gifted and talented programs? And there's some key characteristics of good measurement that help set it up, help prepare it, help ensure the appropriateness for an assessment like the Iowa Assessments in this context. And these words on the screen really talk about general measurement qualities that we want to see regardless of what we're doing or what purpose we're serving. Things like reliability and validity, but also consistency and stability, really speak to those underlying technical attributes that we want to assume are there and that we need to assume as good consumers of measurement information. However, in this context, we also want to stress that these terms take on a slightly more focused interpretation or definition. So reliability, as we think about it for a total test and thinking about an internal consistency, we want to be sure that reliability holds up as we look to slice a very small group of students out of the total distribution. We want to think about validity for those individual students. We know validity is very much situation bound, and we want evidence that suggests the validity is appropriate for this group of test takers. Consistency, we want to be sure that the decisions we're making to allow students in a program or perhaps to deny students being in a program, that those are consistent decisions that would hold up over time, that they have with them a consistency of decision coefficient associated with them to allow those decisions that are being made to be justified. And then stability, to know that the identification of those students would remain the same year after year, and that students once identified, we feel comfortable and confident that they are in the right place. And so that stability factor comes back to aid in that interpretation.
Now these measurement qualities aren't things that come to an assessment just because we think we've done a good job. It really takes a long period of research and development for any new form of the Iowa Assessments to come into being, and a great deal of the work that goes into the development process and the evaluation of the technical quality of the materials that are used to build forms of the Iowa Assessment all focus on ensuring that these measurement qualities are going to exist when the final forms of the assessments are assembled. They're critical in situations where we're using an assessment or a combination of assessments to identify students for particular educational programs. And so both reliability, validity, consistency, and stability are all important attributes you should be looking for as you evaluate your own procedures for identification. Part of that consistency, part of that stability is a stability over time and the development of metrics for reporting test score information whose properties are well understood. These two graphs show characteristics of the Iowa Assessment's vertical scale, the standard scores that are associated with growth and development in students over time. Here are our graphs run from grades 3 through 11, but we could have taken them down to students in kindergarten. In each case, what you see is a metric, the standard score scale, that continues to show growth in students over time. And this is particularly important when we're interested in how increments of growth are being realized in students at the very tops of these distributions. Each of the vertical bars shows the full range of standard scores at a given grade level, but you can see with both reading and mathematics how they steadily march up that numerical scale across grades. The other thing that's important about the metric here of the standard scores for the Iowa assessments is the fact that these standard scores can be aggregated. So if your gifted and talented programs are looking not just at mathematics and reading, as in this example, but also we might incorporate an achievement measure in science or in language arts, that the standard score scale can be aggregated. So what you might see here in two specific curriculum areas can be turned into a composite score for purposes of identification.
Another way to think about and evaluate the Iowa assessments with this purpose in mind is to think about within a grade, whether there is adequate ceiling, whether there is adequate opportunity for students that are performing at the upper ends of the assessment to show what they've known, to show their performance. And this graph, again, is just an illustration of that. This is based on mathematics. Again, we're showing 3 through 8 here just to make it a more manageable graph. But as Steve said, it would go from kindergarten through high school, where we are showing a distribution of performance, and that distribution is wide. It gets wider and wider as students grow, but there is always adequate room towards the top of that performance continuum. Now, coupled with this is there's also standard errors of measurement that allow us to think about how much error, how much variance in the scores that are being reported. And again, thinking about the decisions being made as we look at the standard error of measurement across this performance continuum, it is something we continue to monitor to be sure that the decisions being made at the very top end are as stable as the decisions that are being made in the middle of the distribution or in the low end of the distribution. We know that every point along that distribution is feeding to different kinds of decisions for students. And so we want to have that stability of those decisions in mind as we assemble and validate the Iowa assessments.
All of those characteristics, the idea that we're concerned about the accuracy of measurement at various points on the score scale for this purpose, particularly at the top end of the score scale, begin with the very basic development processes involved in preparing items, field testing items, selecting items for final forms. We're very concerned that as we select items for final forms, we're going to gain those characteristics of reliability and validity, but we're also going to ensure that we've got plenty of ceiling in all of the tests for purposes of accurate measurement at that top end.
Another defining characteristic of the Iowa assessments, as we mentioned, is that vertical scale. And with that vertical scale comes the stable measurement of student growth. And I think thinking about growth, frequently people worry about students at the top end and whether a given assessment will be able to measure the students' growth at that top end in a stable, consistent way. And this graphic shows, if the circled part of this graph shows at the top end how much room there is between that student that's a 99 percentile in grade 3, as represented by the red line, versus a 99 percentile if you're in grade 4, which is represented by the blue, and grade 5, the green, and so forth. The space, as you think from right to left, or as the black lines help us sort of look at the differences in those standard scores, you can come up with that is a significant difference at that top end. And so even though students are there, they're at the top end of the scale, the Iowa assessments as a growth measure still allows for stable estimates of growth and stable projections for where we want students to be the next year, goals and ways to plan looking forward to be sure that growth is obtained.
The other thing that this graph shows, and we may get to this point later on, but this is a good place to introduce it, is the idea that the normative framework and the system of relative comparisons that the research that built the Iowa assessments provides would allow us to take, for example, students at any point in that third grade distribution represented by the curved red line, and by means of either a graphical comparison like this or by use of our conversion tables, we can compare the performance of a third grader at any point in that distribution with the performance of a student at the same point in time in the fourth grade or the fifth grade, so that we can adjust our frame of reference to determine whether or not a student's achievement level in grade 3 would really place that student's achievement more like the achievement of a fifth grader. Those kinds of things, those kinds of metrics and those kinds of relative comparisons are possible with an assessment that is developed, standardized, and normed on comparable school populations at these various grade levels. And that, I think, is a unique feature of the Iowa assessments, well suited to the purpose of gifted and talented identification. And this is just one example of a very detailed set of norms tables that are available for use either within the scoring system for the Iowa assessments or for customized purposes in published form, so that a district could take a standard score of 260, which if we read the first column of this table is at the 95th percentile in reading, and compare that 260 to a student in the following grade, and we might find that 260, which has a national percentile rank of 95 in third grade, has a national percentile rank of 90 in the fourth grade, or of 85 in the fifth grade. Those kinds of customized relative comparisons are all possible with the framework of score reporting for the Iowa assessments.
So Steve has referenced metrics, and I think when you think about the Iowa assessments, one of the primary metrics you think about is the percentile rank, and that national percentile rank, and the confidence we have in that for the purpose of identification rests really with some key defining characteristics of it, that these norms that provide those percentile ranks are regularly updated. They provide multiple times of year. To Steve's point, as students, we know they're changing as they move across years, but we also know that they are changing within a year. So the multiple times of year allows us to provide the most appropriate point of reference. The national norms are representative on many different demographic characteristics, including geography, private, public, size of the school district, location of the school district, as well as the SES indicators that allows us to say with confidence that the sample that is used for the national norms is truly representative of the nation. In addition to representativeness, it presents itself in different metrics. So not only do we think about the percentile rank, but we also think of variations of the percentile rank when we think about Stanines or normal curve equivalence or grade equivalence. Again, all very legitimate metrics that can contribute to conversations, to decisions that are being made for children and the identification of children for various programs. We want to end, and before we turn this over to think about multiple measures, we want to end on an empirical example here. And this comes from a recent year, the administration of the Iowa assessments to an entire state population of test takers. We've pulled the information here in both reading and mathematics as examples. And what we want to show is that how, when the Iowa assessments is given to every student in the state, and those indicators of state measures like proficiency, whether a child is proficient or not, whether a child is advanced or not, whether a child is average relative to the state or not. But there's also another layer of how about the students that have been identified as gifted and talented students? How do they do relative to others? And the Iowa assessments can give us, again, one more way to look at the relative performance of a group of students, a cohort of students that have been identified as gifted and talented. So this chart, and again, we have three different sort of points of reference here. The state population average is here in the green, and this is for a reading on the Iowa assessments. And you can see on the y-axis, we have the scale score associated with the Iowa assessments. And across the horizontal, the x-axis, we have grades going from first grade up through 8th grade. And you can see in the state of Iowa, as you would assume with a good growth indicator, we're seeing change in the state of Iowa as you march from first grade to 8th grade through that green line. But in this state, we also use the Iowa assessments for proficiency indicators. And so you can think of it as a second reference point is that proficiency indicator. Identified here as the black line, the lowest line in that graph, that's showing again those students that are proficient on average and how they're doing across the grade levels. And again, showing a steady upward increase across grade levels. Also, this state identifies students that are in advanced category. So for the purposes of Every Student Succeeds Act, that designation of the advanced student as determined by a cut score represented here in the orange line. And again, they fall above the average for the state, but I think the most interesting part here is they fall well below what is the blue line, which is the plotted line for students that have been identified as gifted and talented, students that are in a program in the state and are receiving gifted and talented resources. And I think that blue line, again, you see is the highest level of performance, but it gives you a point of reference to the others that are very typical points of reference within any state right now as we think about these multiple lenses through which we're trying to look at child performance.
One other point about this graph and the one that you'll see following it for mathematics and that blue line to reinforce a point we were making earlier about the stability of change over time across grade levels, that is. The fact that these the average scores of the talented and gifted group continue to march up that vertical scale is the evidence that we point to in saying that the Iowa assessments has plenty of room for those students to demonstrate their level of achievement relative to other students in this statewide comparison. We see that blue line marching up as fast or faster than even the students who are deemed advanced by the state proficiency standards. And this is an indication that there's plenty of room for the Iowa assessments to demonstrate measured growth for students in talented and gifted programs.
We see a similar pattern in mathematics. They start to separate around third grade and continue that separation all the way through eighth grade. And if we were to plot again all the way through high school, you would see the same pattern continuing. And as Steve said, I think these graphs help us bring together those four words again. We see a stability across all of these trajectories, not only for the gifted and talented, but we see a very stable upward marching across all four of these groups. We think of this as validity evidence because we know the students represented by the blue line have been identified previously and are receiving resources in gifted and talented programs. So we think about that as a source of validity. And we think about this, again, the trajectories as evidence of consistency of decisions here, and showing that they are clearly at a higher level than the other three groups that come out of this particular state's performance.
Thanks, Kathy. I want to take this back to the gifted standards that always guide our decisions around gifted identification, and particularly to highlight why it's so important to have these particular multiple indicators of achievement and ability. So the first standard I have here talks about multiple indicators of potential and achievement. And it's so important in identifying students, especially equitably, that we consider both the current high achievement, but also their potential. So using both of those reference points is really valuable. Standard 2.2.2 talks about the variety of information we need to align students to appropriate services. So there again, just having ability or achievement scores alone gives us less information about what the student's current educational needs will be. And then the last standard I'm highlighting emphasizes the importance of above grade level performance. So when a student is being served or when they're being identified, being able to demonstrate clearly with stability and validity and reliability that they are performing well above grade level is very important. And as you just saw from Steve and Kathy's presentation, the Iowa is very effective at measuring with a very high ceiling, which is what we always want to see in gifted identification. So when we're thinking about multiple measures, some other ways of thinking about it, again, related to quality of assessment, is that every source of data is limited. So we can't measure all types of features of students in one go with one assessment. And every test score has a degree of uncertainty. So when we're thinking about identifying students in a way that is fair and flexible, we want to take into account that students have good days and bad days, that different sources of measurement have different kinds of limitations, like teacher ratings being affected by implicit beliefs. And finally, that, the high stakes associated with any one test can lead to anxiety and decrease the utility of the scores that we get. So we want to think about test scores as one piece of fallible information. And of course, multiple measures are also important based on what we saw in the standards for thinking about our students as multidimensional as well. So they have a variety of strengths and areas for development that we need to address. And so having multiple measures helps us get at that. And then finally, we always want to talk about programming should not be unidimensional, right? The experts in our field say, don't identify students for the gifted program, but for a suite of services. And so having multiple pieces of information helps you make those decisions about what kind of educational interventions would be most effective for these students. So the Iowa assessments and CoGAT have a lot of overlap, but they also measure distinct characteristics of students. So you see here the correlations are about 0.8, which means that they're related but not identical constructs. And so you get information, important information, from contrasting these scores. So here's a highlight. This is from the new data manager system, but it really demonstrates how ability and achievement can be used together to plan instruction for students. So if you look at this figure, you'll see that we've divided up the score distribution into quintiles, so 5 different levels of achievement and ability. And you can do this with any scale that's common across the two tests, so grade percentiles and age percentiles would work. So we've broken up into quintiles and looked at each student's relative performance across an achievement across the Iowa and CoGAT. And if you look along the diagonal line, these are students where ability and achievement scores are giving relatively consistent information. So these are students who, they're performing as well as we would expect in the academic context. So at the higher end of the incline, these students are performing very well and appropriately with what we would expect based on their academic ability. At the other end, those students are also typically performing. What's really interesting when we look at data like this is the students who are off of the diagonal. So if you look kind of towards the top of this figure, there's some students who have relatively higher achievement scores compared to ability. And of course, you want to use concepts like the standard error of measurement to make sure that these are meaningful differences. But in terms of quintiles, these are large differences in performance. So we see that these students have very high achievement and relatively lower ability. And these students are performing very well. So if we're thinking about acceleration, curriculum compacting, other services for these students with high achievement may already be kind of maxing out their performance. They may be getting extra support like tutoring after school, and they're performing very well given their academic ability. So these students might not be ready for acceleration or other forms of compacting because they're already performing kind of at their maximal level. So that might be one way of interpreting that pattern of scores. On the flip side, we have one student who's far off the diagonal below, and that student has high ability. They're in the top quintile, but they're in the low average level of achievement. And the outdated term for that would be an underachiever, right? So this is a student who performs very well on the ability test. So they're able to reflect very creative thinking, complex reasoning skills, and yet they're not performing that well in the classroom. And so just like with the above average achieving student, we want to explore what that means for this student. And so one thing could be that their talents are not being fully leveraged in the classroom because they're bored, maybe they're under challenged, or maybe there's something else going on with them that makes it hard for them to engage fully in the classroom. So any of these students off the diagonal really deserve some additional exploration to figure out what kind of things might be going on for them, what kind of needs they might have. So the student below the diagonal might actually need acceleration. It doesn't seem like, because their achievement's relatively low, it may not seem like they need it, but in fact, curriculum compacting and allowing them to quickly move through the content could be the best thing for that student. So that kind of contrast is what's really important in getting both ability and achievement scores. Another way of thinking about the relationship between ability and achievement scores is the predicted CoGAT scores. These actually come from your Iowa assessment report. These scores come on multiple scales, such as the grade equivalent, national percentile, and the standard score scales, and they show you what the student would be expected to score on the Iowa assessments based on their performance on the CoGAT. And so you can then contrast their actual scores to these predicted scores and reach some of the same interpretations we were just talking about on the previous slide. So if a student has achievement scores that are substantially higher than their CoGAT predicted scores, that means, again, they're achieving well beyond what other students with similar ability can do. So the classroom is working well for them. Some scores substantially lower than predicted. So when you see those predicted CoGAT scores being higher and the achievement is quite low, that's another time when you're going to be looking at some of the needs of that student to provide the appropriate challenge to help them develop those skills. And then another piece of information that you may be interested in is the Iowa Acceleration Scale. So this was developed to help educators and families make those decisions about whole grade acceleration. So it takes a lot of different pieces of information together and compares the student in question to a comparison group of students who have had successful accelerations. Now, this connects to our topic today because to make this decision, you have to have achievement scores using grade level or above grade level norms, so usually 1 to 2 grade levels, to demonstrate that that student is performing well above what is expected for their current grade level. And so the Iowa assessments, because they have such a large ceiling space, are well suited for this purpose. So you may want to consider this as another option to explore the needs of your students. At this point, we're ready to answer your questions. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. Good morning, Dr. Lakin.
Good morning.
I have a couple of questions that that we can talk about this morning. But additionally, I do want to point out we do have the session tomorrow afternoon with Dr. Lakin, which is talking about some tips and tricks for, well, not tricks, but some ideas for equitable identification and kind of streamlining that process and making it a bit easier on yourself. So that's tomorrow afternoon, Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 Central, 1 Mountain, noon Pacific. And then additionally, Dr. Lakin is on a panel with a really interesting group of folks on Monday, and that is 2:15 Eastern Time. Also, in our Riverside Insights booth, we're going to be holding some office hours or booth hours, however you want to think about it, where we're going to have various team members, including Dr. Lakin at a few points, available for your questions and conversation. So what we have open to us today for live Q&A is we have our chat panel. We've had a couple of things come in that have already been answered. But one question that we got, hello, Vicki Thomas. So I see you've joined us as well. So Vicki Thomas is our lead on the Iowa Assessments Program at Riverside, and Vicki Driver, me, is your lead on the CoGAT program at Riverside Insights. And yeah, that's not confusing. Two of us both named Vicki. And we actually both used to have red hair. Some of you may remember that. So then it was really confusing. So we've had a couple of, oh good, there's our slide with our office hours. That's great. So we're going to be available Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday for your questions, a varying slate of us. So a couple of questions that came in. One is, can you use the same achievement scores for multiple purposes, or do you need a standalone assessment for identification? Anybody want to take that one?
Sure. So I beat you to it, Joni. So one of the benefits of using the Iowa assessments in conjunction with the CoGAT is that you've also got the ability to use these types of scores to influence your classroom instruction. One of the initiatives that we're working on, Vicki and I are working on, is making CoGAT and Iowa both more user-friendly and getting these to be utilized within the classroom on a more regular basis, and not just for the identification of gifted students. There's a lot of information that is sitting in these reports that, you know, if you're just using it once a year, you're really missing out on the value. So Joni, what did you want to add?
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, there's no need for separate administration, and you should make as much use as you can out of every piece of test information you have. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we had another question just come in through the chat window that's related to that, which is, what is the recommended frequency of testing, CoGAT and Iowa, for instance? So anybody want to take that one? We can take those separately too.
We'll tackle CoGAT and then I'll tackle Iowa.
Well, it's interesting because we had a conversation about this just the other day between our team members. So what we typically say about CoGAT is that scores can be good for up to 2 years. Now that doesn't mean that you should wait 2 years to retest students. And in particular, the younger students are, the more likely things are to change. The greater a student's lack of opportunity. So let's think about English learners and equity. So a student who has come into your system and isn't speaking English and hasn't had much exposure or hasn't had much exposure to formal schooling and starts getting exposure to these things, I would argue that you need to test those kids more frequently because their rate of acquisition is going to be so very great. Additionally, we have a lot of systems who census test at maybe a couple of points, and then they do referral testing for other kids in the off years. So they may be testing kids at every grade, but they're only census testing at a couple of grades. If you want to get the most value out of the CoGAT scores, that is to say, driving it through instruction, using the ability profile score, and using comparisons with achievement data, again, the more recent your score, the more better the information you're going to be able to drive through instruction. Joni, did you want to add anything for CoGAT? Vicki, you want to tackle Iowa or achievement?
Sure. With the Iowa assessments, you've got 3 different forms, and you've also got survey and complete. So you have many different options with Iowa. Other than just using it to, look at your achievement for your gifted students, this is one of those that you can also use to monitor growth using these different forms.
So I've got a couple more questions here, and actually I think both of these next two are really kind of coming more your way, Joni. So one is reliability and validity were mentioned. But how do I judge that to know if an assessment is right for my program? So in other words, what do I as a person in the trenches really need to know about reliability and validity to make the right decision?
So I think that we made it clear that both are important, right? So reliability is kind of, can I trust this score over time? Or can I trust it over, different interventions or contexts? So, Vicki Thomas was talking about measuring growth. So we want to see some change in scores, but only in response to instruction and not just due to the choice of items or the time of day or how the kid's doing that day. So that's what reliability is really telling us, is how consistent is that score over a short period of time. And that's really useful if you're trying to, well, any score needs to be reliable. If you imagine if you get on your scale in the bathroom every morning and it gave you a totally different number, that would be a useless scale. So that's what reliability is really giving us, is that consistency. And that's important because we want to know that the gains or the changes are due to our instructional practices and not just due to the randomness of the scores. Validity is really important for the idea of predicting outcomes. So really depends on how you're going to use it. So the answer to all these questions is it depends, right? How frequently should I do it? It depends. What's the right validity evidence? It depends. So in this case, we want to look at kind of the outcomes that you want to see. So validity is really about, can I make the interpretations I want? So a lot of you are making interpretations about instructional need. Do they need acceleration, curriculum compacting, et cetera? Are they going to be more successful in a math or a reading domain? And those determine kind of the validity questions you want to ask. So in terms of CoGAT, we always talk about encourage people to use the batteries rather than the composite score, because the batteries tell you about, how the student's going to perform when there are, heavy reading demands or a lot of lecture-based learning. You're going to have stronger verbal reasoning skills to be successful. And so that's a kind of validity that's more specific to different domains. And the composite score might just tell you that generally the student has an easier or harder time learning. But those battery scores, because they predict domain performance, another form of validity, they're more useful for that purpose.
So we often joke and say that the psychometrician's answer to every question is it depends, but it truly is. One quick thing I would say about reliability and validity is that people hear those terms and they think maybe there's a hard and fast rule about them. So we talk about reliability in terms of numbers, a statistical procedure. And what you really want to think about there is more a range. The closer you get to 1, the better the number is. So a lot of programs look for that number to be over a 0.8, between a 0.8 and close to 1 on that reliability statistic. Validity, however, is not a number. That's ensuring that we've looked at the purpose for which you want to use the test. So for instance, in the case of the Iowa assessments, I want to be able to measure growth with this assessment. We have looked at that use case and we have said, yes, definitively, this assessment measures growth. So you're looking for those kind of definitive answers. We have looked at this assessment for that purpose. We have looked at CoGAT for whether it distinguishes among really high ability students to help you understand which ones need greater challenge in the curriculum. We have looked at that use case, and yes, this assessment is appropriate for that. So you're looking for a more qualitative answer around your validity case. We had a couple other questions come in while you were answering that last one, Joni, which I'd like to send over to you as a pair. So do you recommend this as testing for a whole grade or only for students who may qualify for gifted? And similarly, do you recommend using CoGAT as a universal screener? And if so, what grade? So those two questions are really related. What's the importance of universal screening, and what happens if you do referral testing?
Yeah, so the first question is easy but complicated. So testing the entire grade, a universal screening, 100% good idea. On the flip side, it's expensive and there's resources invested. So I'm not saying that's an easy solution, but the research consistently shows that if you want to have more equitable identification, you need to screen universally. Any other kind of indicator, whether it's teacher ratings or teacher referrals or portfolios, they just tend to be skewed towards kids who manifest talents in more traditional ways. So it's just really important that you give every student an opportunity to demonstrate academic reasoning skills in a way that is not determined by adults' expectations for those students. So I see a lot of people trying to do teacher ratings, but teachers are humans and we have implicit biases. And as soon as you do a portfolio or an observation, it's still human involved. So, obviously humans build tests too, but they're better at kind of seeing through that and being more equitable in terms of every student getting an opportunity to demonstrate those skills. What grade levels? So in terms of equity, younger is better. That's kind of somewhat consistent finding in the research. So the younger they are, the less likely it is that the quality of education they've gotten is going to influence their scores. But on the flip side, young children are, developmentally very variable. So, we never advocate a one and done approach to identification, and especially not the younger they are. No kindergartner should take a single test and have decisions made for their entire K-12 education. That's just terrible practice. We want to use, follow-up and other opportunities to qualify or other opportunities to have your needs assessed throughout the K-12 process. But in terms of where should you invest the resources into a universal screening, our most popular levels are grades 2 and 3. I really advocate for 2 because that's where we have the fully nonverbal options for administering CoGAT. So it does verbal, it does quantitative, it does figural, but in nonverbal format. So if you have English learners, if you have any concerns about language demands of the test, I would lean towards 2nd grade. And then of course the K and the 1st grade levels are also can be nonverbally administered. So those are available too. So some people choose 1st and kindergarten, but 2nd grade is really a popular level to start differentiating for gifted and talented.
And I think it comes back to the earlier question we answered as well. Well, actually 2 earlier questions that we answered. One was about reliability. And one of the things that we find is that the reliability tends to become stronger. That is, it becomes a higher number as we go up through the assessment test levels. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is that, as Joni mentioned, young kids are scattered. Harder to get their attention. They have more good and bad days. They're developing at such a crazy fast rate, as well as the assessments for the older kids tend to have more test items on them because we can get them to sit still longer. And the more test items you have, the more it helps your reliability of the assessment. The other piece is going to back to that question that we answered about, how often should I administer the test? So we typically say, you know, the scores for CoGAT can be good for up to 2 years. Obviously on achievement, you wouldn't want to go 2 years without having an achievement measure on your kids. But the younger the kids are, the more you might want to test more frequently just because they are developing more quickly. And I actually have another question that and we had another one come in through the window too. So let me ask this question, which is, what are some of the ways that you can integrate information from different assessments? And stated another way is, how do you compare achievement to ability scores? So one simple metric for that was shown where we charted them against each other, but in identification, how would you use these together?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting how this person phrased it. They said, do students ever score well on CoGAT and Iowa but not qualified? Or do they score well on CoGAT but not Iowa? Or do they do one or the other? So the decision to identify a student, let me take a step back. I don't like the use of labels, right? So a student is not gifted or not gifted. It's not like a stamp you put on the kid and send them out in the world. It's really important that you think about this as instructional need. What does the student need now? You know, and that's why you need to reassess it in a year, because they're going to develop differently. They're going to have different needs. You know, a lot of people like take it to sports. I wouldn't place a student in a position, heaven help you if you put me in charge of your football team, but I'm not going to put a kid in a certain position and then just expect them to always be quarterback, running back, whatever it is. I'm going to move them around and kind of see how it's going, and they're going to excel, you know, some years and kind of not, you know, if you don't get tall and big in high school, you're off the varsity team, right? So there's these things about development that we understand when we're talking about physical strength and abilities, but they also apply to academics. So there's students who respond really well to the training and opportunities that we give them. And there's students that struggle more and need more differentiation. There's students who do well now and then not in the future. So what I'm trying to convey is sort of this need to look holistically at test scores at any given time. So, you know, if you use a variety of measures and they have, you know, CoGAT scores and Iowa scores and a bunch of other things, it's absolutely possible that that student would qualify or wouldn't qualify for a particular program. It just depends on what the program is and what they're serving. And obviously the exact question of, you know, how you qualify depends on the district, on their policies in a given year. So, so that one we can't really answer for you. I'm sure it's happened, but that, you know, that's kind of a separate question of what's the program, what's the program goal, and is CoGAT in Iowa appropriate for that? But what I get a lot is sort of, well, I got different answers from the ability and the achievement test. So which one's right? That's where we want to think more deeply about what these different assessments are measuring. So I talked a little bit about, you know, achievement measuring. I think Steve and Kathy talked about, you know, achievement measuring standards aligned accomplishments, you know, the school-based performance of a student. And ability is trying to get a little broader than that. So it's the ability to reason, to think critically, and it's not specifically tied to content. It's broader, more kind of use it in your everyday life, but also in the classroom. So there are different pieces of information. And if you think about teacher ratings, right, that's observable characteristics of the students. It might be motivation, leadership skills, all these other things. Those are not interchangeable in terms of, does the student need a gifted program or not, or, you know, acceleration or whatever the intervention is. They're different pieces of information because a student needs to have the academic ability, but also the motivation. They need to be engaged in the classroom, you know, and have that positive rapport with the teacher and the school system. All those things are necessary for student success. So any indicator that's giving you different information about students, you really don't want to think about it in terms of like, oh, well, this one's high, so it must be the right, you know, the right score. The student's really gifted. You're just getting different information. So that's where we really want to think about how they work together. So we talked about that diagonal with the ability and the achievement contrast, and that's how you want to think about all pieces of information. It's kind of, is it measuring something different? So that goes back to that validity question. It's measuring a different thing. Then, you know, if it doesn't agree, that doesn't mean one is right or wrong. It just means it's different information. So a student could be highly motivated, but not have that much ability in a domain. They could have really high achievement, and be disengaged. And there's all kinds of features of students. They're, multidimensional, as we said earlier.
I think this question about, can a student score well on CoGAT and Iowa? So let's say we have multiple measures in our matrix, and a given student scores well on both of them. Is that student automatically qualified for gifted or advanced academics? Sorry, I'm going to throw it out there again. It depends, because the other thing that's important here is the local context. So when we talk about a student performing well, we can think about that in terms of national norms, which is to say there can be a student in the 99th percentile on CoGAT. We actually have 30 points of range in our 99th percentile. So there are all kinds of degrees of performing well. And for a given school system, the question that we're really asking is not, did that student perform well, but are they so different from their peers in the regular classroom that it's clear that they need something additional in terms of advanced academics. And one of my contexts for this is I had the privilege of working with one of the highest performing school districts in the country who had both achievement and ability scores like I have never seen before. And they were incredibly high. And what that means is that the vast majority of kids were very well served by what was going on in the regular classroom and did not need a referral to another advanced academic program because the level in the classroom was already so high. So there are certainly contexts in which students can perform well by a variety of measures, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be accelerated to something else. Their solid performance in that context may actually just be a reflection that they're getting exactly what they need where they are. So as a psychometrician, I will come back as always and say, it depends, which is a very frustrating answer, I know. Do we have any closing thoughts? We've gotten our 2-minute warning. It's time for us to wrap it up. Any closing thoughts? Session tomorrow afternoon. Dr. Lakin has a session on Monday as well, and we will be holding booth hours every single day.
The session on Monday, it's for people who wrote chapters for this book that I just got in the mail yesterday. I don't think that's a coincidence. Unlocking Potential. So Tamara Stambaugh at Vanderbilt and Paula Olszewski-Bilius at Northwestern were the editors. And so that's going to be a really good session too about low-income students and how we identify them for gifted. So it'll be good stuff.
Okay, so to everyone who joined us, thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow and Friday and Saturday. Have a great rest of your day.